Hey everybody, Trapper here. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Colorado TechCast. Colorado TechCast is a weekly podcast where I interview CEOs and founders of Colorado-based technology startups. Join me each episode as I explore the Colorado technology community from the inside out. This is our third joint interview with the Colorado Technology Association. And again, I'm joined by Franny Matthews, President and CEO of the Colorado Technology Association. Franny, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Trapper. These have been a lot of fun to do, and I am really thrilled about this one because we're joined by Attorney General Weiser today. Attorney General Weiser has been Colorado's AG since January of 19. He's committed to building an organization that really protects Coloradoans while ensuring that innovation and collaboration thrives. And he's been tackling a wide range of challenges, including opioid epidemic and protecting our land and water. Before running for office, he was the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, where he founded the Silicon Flatirons Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship. He's got a really great background, and one of my favorite things is that Phil had an opportunity to be a law clerk for Byron R. White and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so very exciting background. Welcome.
It's really great to be with you all.
Phil, with the recent outbreak of Corona and all the trouble that that's caused, can you talk a little bit about what your...
I would put our actions into three buckets. Situation? One is ingenuity and innovation. Two is resilience. And third is grace. So first on ingenuity and innovation, we've had to stand up for the first time ever a public health enforcement unit. If you'd asked me 3 months ago, what is public health enforcement? I'm not sure I could have given you an answer because public health enforcement wasn't on our radar. But now we're enforcing public health orders. And for a while, we were managing a serious operation of 50 people in our office, all working some amount of time to get complaints when people were filing them. That's been a big change that we've had to adapt to. Also, we've now gotten into the world of price gouging complaints and coronavirus scams, people claiming that tests work and are FDA approved when they're not. So we have to be innovative as Coloradans. We have to be adaptive. Our office is working all remote, as are many offices. That's part of what's going to get us through. Second, we've got to be resilient. And when we don't have resiliency, whether it's testing capacity or broadband capability for people doing online learning, that is a danger Will Robinson moment that we all need to pay attention to. That's why I led a coalition of 39 state AGs to fight for more broadband funding, because we know, particularly in the tech community, this is not an option. This is an essential service for people. It is a matter of economic prosperity, opportunity, and so much more. So that's something that's going to be critical on our future agenda. And then third, with respect to grace, a lot of people are hurting. We've got an emerging economic crisis on top of a public health crisis. And whether it's student loans or people worried about being evicted from their places where they live, this is something that we are on top of. And we've got an important role to play to create more grace for people who are hurting. And we're working hard to do that as well.
You know, Phil, I know you had worked, it's simple things that happen and that can cause people on the margins to tumble. And I know that you've done some work around getting rid of the cash bail requirements for low risk offenders. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the effect has been on that?
This, in a way, is about innovation. It's about resilience, and it's about grace. It's about innovation because too often government just does what we've always done before, not asking what's the best way to do something. And yes, our model is cash bail, which is when you're arrested, you sit in jail unless you can put up a bail bond, and that takes money. Half of Americans couldn't put together $400 in an emergency situation. And that means so many people, because they're poor, are going to sit in jail. Even if they haven't committed a crime, they might have been arrested and may never be convicted, but they're going to be in jail for what could be a substantial amount of time. Second, this is about resilience because we have to recognize that a lot of people are living on the edge. And when we put them in jail for even 48 hours, 72 hours more, you knock them out of their lifestyle. They're away from their family. They may lose their job. And that's not healthy for them individually, for our society. It can actually lead to more public safety challenges. And finally, it's about grace. It's about recognizing that people who may not have money shouldn't be punished basically just because they can't afford cash bail. So for me, this is a moral imperative. It's a public safety imperative. It's an economic imperative. It's unfortunately going to cost money. And one of the tragedies right now in our budget situation is I don't see the money there to support this change. And even though the payback will be huge on the back end, it takes a front end investment. And so it pains me that we are likely going to defer progress on this issue, which to me is super important.
Yeah, I also kind of look at this and think of the broadband implementations kind of the same way. If you have kids falling behind in school because they can't get virtual classroom experience or even interact, what that does to them, that's a tumbling thing that will affect for many years, maybe their entire lifetime.
Absolutely. This is for me a big challenge with government, which is how do we think about investments? And sometimes we think about them in an overly short-term way, which is we can't afford it right now. The other side is we can't not afford it. We can't not afford to have cash bail reform or to leave people without access to broadband so they don't learn properly or get healthcare. So this is a big challenge. I'm going to keep pushing on it, and I'm not afraid to push for change.
Well, we appreciate that. The other things that are coming up with this, as we get out of safer at home kind of environments and get out and reopen things, in order for us to stay safe, there's certain things that need to happen, like testing and also tracing. What this brings me to think about data privacy issues and security issues. Can we talk a little bit about that from a COVID perspective and the reaction that we are going to see?
Yes, absolutely. Insofar as there are systems that are going to trace where people are, who they're in contact with, there are big privacy issues there. And we're going to be on top of them, evaluating how we protect people. Part of what puts us at disadvantage is we've not developed baseline privacy protections. And so we're forced to do this, if you will, on a more sectoral or ad hoc basis. And that's something that we really have to get better at, which is how do we think more broadly about privacy? Ideally, that would be a federal government initiative. I worked in the Obama White House where there was an effort to do a privacy bill of rights. Unfortunately, that didn't get enacted. So now we're talking about these issues at the state level, and California famously did move ahead. We will have those discussions in Colorado, how we look for broad privacy protections. We do have a data security law we passed here in Colorado that provides protections as well as puts obligations on any business that collects and manages and stores data. We're working hard to get the word out about what that requires. So there's a lot of work around data privacy and security, and we just hired a data privacy council in our office to elevate the game of the state of Colorado as we think hard about how we manage our data and protect Coloradans.
It's interesting on the data privacy side, one of the big issues is litigation and who takes action. Should it be your office, or could there be civil action against somebody that, had a data breach that, hadn't done all the right things? What are your feelings on that?
The current law we have on data security only authorizes our office to act. And that's something that ensures that this law doesn't get abused so that you basically get people doing what you might call nuisance litigation. With respect to data privacy, we haven't gotten far enough in a bill to cross this bridge. It's obviously a topic of a lot of conversation, and I tend to reserve my thoughts on bills till they actually are developed and introduced. So that discussion will go forward. With the data security case, it is indeed just us who has enforcement authority.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And you also mentioned regulation just in general. We're not seeing as much regulation at the federal level. And a lot of these issues, from my 8th grade civics class, these are interstate issues. So I'm kind of interested in, if there is federal regulation, how's that fit with what is already happening? It's very confusing, certainly for the business community.
I talked about this in a speech last year at an International Association of Privacy Professionals. And what I said is we're now in the world of the second best, which is states working to take the lead, address these issues that are indeed interstate issues. The best of all worlds, we'd see action by Congress, We don't have a functional Congress right now, unfortunately, and I'm not sure when we will. So that's not happening. What I can say is when we do get federal legislation in this area, I do believe we're going to see something like we see in Dodd-Frank, which is state AGs with authority to enforce federal privacy law, because it's important that you not put all your eggs in one basket, which is, for example, what would happen if you had only a federal regulatory system with no ability of state AGs to enforce it. State AGs could enforce federal law under the Dodd-Frank situation, and I think it would be good to have, if there's a federal privacy law, state AG enforcement as well.
I look just in general at the philosophy of regulation around technology, and technology is moving so fast. And I am always interested in figuring out how what's the framework that you look at for putting regulation in that is going to be sustainable over time?
This is something I've thought a lot about. I've written a lot about. And one phrase I've used is we need entrepreneurial administration. Another phrase is adaptive regulation. The risk, and this could happen in privacy regulation, for example, that you have something which is overly prescriptive, which locks in a particular technology. That's actually the worst thing that could happen. You could really do damage because we need to leave agility in the system, which is dynamic. And that means focusing on core principles and values, leaving that flexibility, and having a regulatory system that can adapt and indeed even leverage technology. I would point out to the Obama administration developed this NIST framework for cybersecurity as a really good example of adaptive and dynamic regulation.
The other thing that I get concerned about is that for large companies, they've got the economy of scale to be able to do whatever the most stringent is. So if California's regulation is the most stringent, they play to that and they can kind of get, some standardization in their process. For entrepreneurs, and I know that most of them, it's, there's a safe zone until you get to a critical mass, but it worries me that it's going to inhibit entrepreneurs to scale. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you avoid that in policy?
Well, part of what you often see is for companies of a certain size, the requirements don't take hold. And that leaves some room for companies to operate before they're subject to certain requirements. So we need to think hard what requirements need to be on what size companies, and recognize that if you have too much of a burden, startups are going to have a hard time getting off the ground. That's something that we need to worry about. So I do think a lot about startups, and if there are requirements, making sure the cost of compliance are manageable. Part of what we have to recognize is technology and technology companies are going to be an engine of helping us adapt, providing a engine for economic growth. And we need that to be inclusive growth. We need to ensure that people who are struggling, I mentioned the folks who paying cash bail could be literally knocking them off their feet. We need a real thoughtful agenda around how we support people who otherwise could be left behind. The risks that we have in our society, gaps between rural and urban, for example, those are ones that we all need to take seriously with a spirit that we're all in this together. We have that in Colorado, a great entrepreneurial community here where there's a spirit of give before you get, or be there for each other. And that's something that propelled Startup Colorado, something I helped found and is now focused on supporting rural entrepreneurship. So that's, I think, the closing thought, which is we're going to get through this. The technology industry is going to be a leader, and we've got a lot of work to do together to make sure that we can build the Colorado that we need and that serves everybody.
I agree. I have one other closing question. I understand that you argued to the U.S. Supreme Court recently, virtually. Is that correct?
That is true. I argued to the U.S. Supreme Court by telephone. This was a great adaptation, and it was I would say, peak professional experience, because when you're arguing for the Supreme Court, you've got to be on your toes. You've got to be prepared. So I worked hard to prepare my argument. It was around what we call faithless electors. Electors under Colorado law have to vote for the candidate the people of Colorado wanted. Unfortunately, in this case, an elector said, I want to go rogue and vote for somebody else. Our Secretary of State said, well, you can't be an elector. You're trying to cast an illegal ballot. And now that issue is at the Supreme Court. We like our position, and I think I got my argument across even by telephone to the court.
That's terrific. Well, sometimes this virtual stuff does work.
Amen. It worked here. It's great.
Well, terrific. Well, thank you so much for your time today. You've been very generous, and we appreciate being able to share your point of view with other Coloradans.
It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. I thank you for it, and keep up all the great work now.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Head on over to our website at coloradotechcast.com and hit the big subscribe button so you never miss a new episode. I'm Trapper Little, and I'll catch you again on the next episode of Colorado TechCast.